非常感谢麦克罗瓦博士详细的为我们进行了碳市场相关条文的说明，而且也分享了对于台湾如何参与国际碳市场的看法。那最后一场的演讲我们邀请到的是伦敦政经学院气候变迁与环境的 Josh Burke 曾经与我国的环保署合作，完成了台湾的第一本碳定价的研究报告，对于台湾的碳定价的政策十分的熟悉。那我们一起来听听看他对于台湾的碳定价的一个看法，以及对于我们企业如何因应国际碳市场的一个建议。那我们欢迎他。
Thank you for the opportunity to present today. My name is Joshua Burke. I'm a Senior Policy Fellow at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. Today's presentation will focus on carbon pricing options for Taiwan, and most of my work over the last couple of years has been focused on the political economy of carbon pricing for net zero, and the distributional impacts of carbon pricing on households. And this work stems from a research visit to Taiwan just before the pandemic and a continued collaboration with the EPA and other think tanks in Taiwan. I hope you enjoy the presentation. Thank you. Today's presentation will focus on carbon pricing options for Taiwan. I'll begin with a brief overview of the role of carbon pricing, its momentum across the globe, as well as some of the UK's own experiences with carbon pricing before then turning to the specific context in Taiwan. The work that I'll present today follows a program of work we've been doing on Taiwan over the last 24 months, which started with a trip I took, organised by the British office to present the UK's experience, and then culminated with this report, which we published last year. So climate policies need to deal with several barriers, and carbon pricing is just one of those policies. But if we start with that, so at the core of the climate problem is the need to address the climate change externality, and this is where carbon pricing is particularly important. It's an efficient fiscal tool to encourage abatement where it is cheapest and ensures the polluter must pay. This is in line with a central tenet of environmental law. But the efficiency of carbon pricing is that how individuals or companies or firms abate is up to them. And it's this flexibility which is associated with lower compliance costs. And there are two strands to carbon pricing. It can either be done via a tax or via an emissions trading scheme. And the choice between these two instruments is essentially a choice between different risks. The risk of price certainty or uncertainty, which you get in an emissions trading scheme, or emissions certainty or uncertainty, which you get either via a tax or a trade. So it's a choice between different risks over the price of permits or the quantity of emissions. The alternative is that you could have a hybrid scheme, which is what the UK has. So in the UK, we have a domestic emissions trading scheme, but we also have a carbon tax on top of that, which initially began as a top up to the low prices in the EU ETS. But aside from carbon pricing, there are other barriers holding back low carbon investment. In theory, a high carbon price could overcome these barriers, but it would need to be exceptionally high with large distributional implications, particularly on households or industry. So carbon pricing is best if it is accompanied by complementary policies. And here we've got to remove associated barriers around energy efficiency or clean innovation. This is where additional policies are needed. And like I said, mitigate unintended consequences is a really important part of any carbon pricing scheme, particularly on fuel poverty or vulnerable households, where increases in carbon prices could increase the cost of electricity within the home and push those into fuel poverty, but also with competitiveness and the impact on industry. But what we have seen today, and this is a very important point, is that the impact of asymmetric carbon prices across jurisdictions or regions has in fact got very little evidence to suggest that this has had an impact on competitiveness. So that's an important point to bear in mind. All of the evidence to date suggests that carbon pricing has had a very small impact on industry. Now, the international momentum for carbon pricing is growing, and at the time of writing the report, there were 64 carbon pricing initiatives in operation, and this is a combination of carbon taxes and cap and trade programs. These were either in place or in the process of implementation, and in just 2019 alone, 10 new schemes were introduced. These initiatives are spread globally, with South Africa becoming the first African country to price carbon. Singapore became the latest country in Asia to introduce a carbon tax. And Mexico's emissions trading scheme is paving the way for emissions trading in Latin America. And the figure here shows that the various jurisdictions where some form of carbon pricing is implemented, scheduled for implementation, are under consideration. And with the rulebook for Article 6 now confirmed at the Glasgow summit recently, this has further cemented the role of carbon pricing in global and domestic mitigation plans. And even the finalisation of that rulebook has had an impact on carbon prices already. If we look at the European emissions trading scheme, there's already been a price spike following the completion of Article 6, because that's given more confidence to the market that carbon pricing is going to play a more prominent role going forward. So what is the UK's experience of carbon pricing? So the UK has, as I mentioned earlier, a combination of emissions trading schemes and a carbon tax, and these both apply to the UK power sector. So the data we have here shows the amount of coal generation in terawatt hours, and the bars signify the UK's carbon price signal, which is split between the carbon price support in red, which is the tax, and the emissions trading scheme in green, which is the EU emissions trading scheme. This is prior to the exit from the European Union and the introduction of the UK's new domestic scheme. But what we've seen, and this is the big takeaway, is that carbon prices reduce emissions. As we see the bars increasing, we see the amount of coal generation declining. It's a very simple relationship that we have here. And as we saw, the green bars are reducing over time up until 2013, at which point the UK introduced this top up, the carbon price support, which increases in red. And that increases the total price that UK firms were faced. And that had a very dramatic effect on the UK's amount of coal production. So a report by the Energy Market Regulator in the UK found that carbon prices reduced emissions at a lower cost and at a quicker pace than other policies such as taxes and regulations. And what we've seen is a confluence of market drivers and regulatory interventions that have reduced coal generation. And successive governments have shown a willingness to intervene in the marketplace through a robust carbon price. But this has also been accompanied by technology phase-out mandates, which have been used to make up for uncertainty around future carbon price. And the prevalence of such mandates are often a reaction to the political economy constraints of carbon pricing. But importantly here, the UK didn't just rely on carbon prices, and this comes back to my very first slide. Carbon prices are far more effective if they're complemented by other policies. So here we had the carbon price, but we also had legislation to limit the operating hours of coal-fired power stations. We also had regulations on the phase-out date. So we initially started at 2025 and this was brought forward. But then in addition to that, there were also subsidies to lower the cost of cleaner alternatives that companies could switch to. So we had a strong combination of subsidies, taxes and regulations. At the heart of this was a carbon price, but those subsidies and regulations performed a very important role. And this combination has driven coal from a position of 40% of the UK's power mix in roughly 2016 to less than 2% today. So what we've shown is that it can be done, it can be affordable, and because the cost of renewables is falling in other countries all over the world, that this transition can also be done very quickly and very affordably in other countries as well. If we look at the specific work we've done for Taiwan, this slide outlines the key considerations. So Taiwan is likely to choose to implement either a carbon levy or an ETS. And in theory, these two carbon pricing instruments could achieve exactly the same outcome in a given time period if there's no uncertainty and the instruments are calibrated to produce the same carbon price. But in practice, however, factors including the uncertainty regarding the future trajectory of emissions, the cost of mitigation, broader economic circumstances, political economy considerations, and the ability to give away free allowances under an ETS mean that these instruments have important differences, which often dictate the choice between the two in the short and the long run. And what we really wanted to do in our research was try and identify and distinguish the short-run barriers, which are often political, legal, and institutional factors, from the longer-run objectives, so the environmental outcomes, the economic efficiency, competent policy administration, for example. And when evaluating the viability of carbon price instruments, these are important factors to consider. So in the short run, the ease of administration and simplicity of policy design and implementation are often important factors in determining what kind of carbon pricing instrument is feasible. For example, it can take significant time to build the capacity needed to support effective carbon markets. And in particular, policy design for an emissions trading scheme has to address the challenges from an illiquid or uncompetitive markets. Whereas in contrast, a carbon levy is comparatively simple and can often be implemented by simply building on systems established for existing energy and environmental taxes. And when assessing the legal and institutional factors, introducing a carbon tax may appear the easier choice. However, political factors may make the introduction of certain types of policy infeasible. This is a particularly important issue for carbon taxes, and we've seen that in countries around the world, in France and in other parts of the world. We know that consumers are very sensitive to changes in price, and people have an aversion to taxes more generally, and carbon taxes specifically. So even though an examination of what is politically possible may suggest policy makers choose an instrument that looks comparatively worse on legal or institutional grounds, such as an emissions trading scheme, but this will also have far greater political feasibility. So this is what we were really trying to tease out in this report. So in the long run, differences in the fundamental attributes of carbon levies and ETSs may actually determine the long-run development of carbon pricing policy. So this means that understanding the fundamental objectives of a jurisdiction in introducing carbon pricing should therefore influence its longer-term development. So what does this mean specifically for Taiwan? Well, there's several barriers that we identified which could influence the choice of carbon pricing options in the short run. The first is coverage of the electricity sector. The second is industrial competitiveness, carbon leakage and wider economic impact. The third is the risk of concentrated market power and insufficient liquidity in an ETS. And the last is capacity for implementation. So then we've tried to overlay that into how that impacts on the short-run instrument choice and the short-run instrument design. So with regards to the implementation capacity, a carbon levy here is preferred. And this is because industry is more familiar with the fees, but also averse to the administrative burden of ETS trading, which can take time to develop. Another factor in short-run instrument choice is that the challenge of the secondary market, and this must be addressed in terms of liquidity and the impact of concentrated market power in the power sector. So options here could include purchasing holding limits, frequent auctions, consignment auctions, and expanding the ETS scope. So how does this affect short-run instrument design? So first of all, it means regulating the electricity sector, and this must be covered if possible. I think Thai power can be regulated by a carbon levy after amendments to the GHG Act, and it is important that costs are passed through to electricity users via consumption charge. In terms of competitiveness, the cost impact will focus on emissions-intensive and trade-exposed industries, and this can be effectively addressed in a levy or an ETS. And this could be done via free allowances or other ways of compensating firms. So how does this translate into long-run options for carbon pricing development in Taiwan? So as I said, the fundamental policy objectives rather than the implementation capacity should determine the long-run development of carbon pricing policy in Taiwan. And the proposal that we have set out is heavily influenced by the ease of the initial policy implementation upon passing of the necessary legislation. In the long run, the capacity implementation will no longer be a binding constraint for policymakers, and therefore should not be a determining factor for policy design. The government could move gradually from carbon pricing policy towards a configuration that aligns with the policy priorities. The optimal design for carbon pricing in Taiwan will therefore depend on the importance of pursuing such goals as achieving emissions targets, raising stable revenue for the government, and mobilizing investment in low carbon technology. So what does this translate into policy recommendations? So the first is that starting with a simple carbon levy set at an initially low level but with a clear trajectory to reach higher prices. And by starting with a low price, it gives the opportunity to learn by doing, to understand the operation of the levy and its impacts on covered firms. However, what's really important here is that a clear trajectory of price increases over time is needed to ensure sufficient decarbonisation incentives. The second recommendation is that there should be an option to retain the possibility of altering the design of its carbon pricing options over time as circumstances change. So the simple approach that we recommend can be designed with the inbuilt flexibility, enabling the policy to be improved over time and providing the opportunity to move to an emissions trading scheme if this is desirable at a future date. The third option is that, or the third design characteristic is that it should cover the full set of greenhouse gas emissions from large emitters in manufacturing and, if possible, electricity generation. The focus on large emitters complements the pre-existing reporting of emissions for large emitters. And the electricity sector is a large source of emissions in Taiwan, and its inclusion would cover the indirect emissions of households and the services sector as well. So how should the private sector respond after the introduction of a carbon price? So the private sector can either adapt or it can innovate. And the figure here represents the conceptual distinction between the two. And when I use the terms adopt and innovate, this is to refer loosely to the use of existing abatement technologies and the development of new ones. So adoption moves a firm along its marginal abatement cost curve. After adopting the cheapest available option, it faces a higher marginal cost for the next increment of abatement. By contrast, innovation expands the technology set and creates opportunities for greater abatement at a given marginal cost. This shifts the marginal abatement cost curve inward. So for a firm under a cap and trade program, the shaded area A on the left-hand side represents the savings from adopting the cheaper abatement options instead of purchasing the emissions allowance needed to cover its uncontrolled emissions. Firms not subject to the cap have no comparable incentive. So even if the emissions price is passed on to unregulated firms in the form of higher product prices, this incentivizes them to adopt technologies that rely less on pollution-intensive intermediate goods rather than technologies that reduce their own emissions. A firm regulated under a cap and trade programme can expect to earn a surplus B if it innovates on the right hand side. So its gains come both from the lower abatement cost for a given level of abatement and from a lower emissions price that occurs when the new technology comes into general use and reduces aggregate demand for emissions allowances. So the shaded area A shows the gain from doing so. Innovation increases the availability of abatement technologies, illustrated as a pivot of the marginal cost curve in the right-hand panel. So since the technology frontiers shift for all firms, innovation reduces aggregate demand for allowances and the price of permits falls. The shaded area B shows the reduction in a regulated firm's compliance cost that results from this innovation. So the emissions price will also incentivise firms that are not regulated by the cap, since uncapped firms can profit by selling the new emissions saving technology to capped firms. So as long as a third-party innovator cannot fully extract the capped firm's surplus, though the same emissions price will provide a weak innovation incentives for uncapped firms. So in theory, or what theory doesn't tell us rather, is whether the wedge between the innovation incentives of capped and uncapped firms is large or small. But what research does suggest is that it's big enough to be empirically relevant. And whether a cap and trade programme will primarily encourage adoption or innovation will depend on the current abatement options and the potential technological innovation. So that concludes my presentation. I really welcome the opportunity to continue this research, and I welcome any questions that may follow. My email address will be circulated after, so please get in touch if there's anything you would like to follow up with, and I hope to continue this collaboration. Many thank you.